You know what the cruelest part of waking up from a nightmare is? Realizing that the nightmare is actually waiting for you outside the hospital doors. Let me take you back to a brutal, freezing late autumn afternoon in Evanston, Illinois. The kind of bone-chilling winter day where the wind cuts straight through your coat and every single breath turns into sharp, white smoke. I was sitting in the passenger seat of my friend's old sedan, clutching my 6-day-old daughter, Maya, tightly against my chest. My C-section incision still throbbed with a dull, white-hot agony. Every bump in the road felt like a knife, twisting deep inside my abdomen. I was exhausted, sleep-deprived, and aching. All I wanted was to crawl into my own bed, take a long, hot shower, and let my husband, Julian, wrap his arms around us both. Julian Vance, a man I had trusted with my entire life, a senior financial consultant whose calm voice and polished smiles were supposed to be my safe harbor. We pulled up to our home on Elm Street, our turquoise-trim Victorian house, the place where we had painted the nursery, where my grandmother's vintage wind chimes still hung by the front porch, except as my friend parked the car, my breath caught in my throat. There was a massive moving truck parked in our driveway. Strangers were casually hauling heavy cardboard boxes right through our front door. I blinked, completely disoriented. I remember trying to tell myself this had to be a bizarre mix-up, that maybe the movers were at the wrong address. I carried newborn Maya, swaddled in her little pink blanket, up the porch steps. A kind-looking older man stopped, looked down at my baby, and then looked at me with genuine, agonizing pity. "Ma'am," he said softly, keeping his voice gentle, "we legally closed on this house 3 days ago. We bought it from Julian Vance." My knees buckled. The world tilted sideways. I stumbled to the front door and jammed my key into the lock. It wouldn't turn. I remember trying it again and again, because my brain simply refused to accept what my eyes were seeing. A brand new, heavy-duty deadbolt, one I had never seen in my life, had been bolted into the wood. The new homeowner walked over, looking deeply uncomfortable, and handed me a crisp piece of paper. "I'm really sorry," he whispered. "The title company told us everything was finalized." It was the official closing statement. There was our address, there was Julian's signature, and right next to it, what looked sickeningly like mine, a flawless forgery. My hands began to shake so violently I nearly dropped the papers. Maya stirred in her blanket, letting out a tiny, sleepy whimper that somehow dragged me back to raw, bleeding reality. I couldn't fall apart, not while I was holding my newborn. Not yet. My fingers flew to my phone. I dialed Julian's cell phone number. It rang twice, and then clicked open. Before I could even choke out a word, Julian's voice came through the speaker, ice cold, completely devoid of human warmth, and carrying the crisp background noise of an upscale downtown Chicago cafe. "Claire, stop calling. The house is sold, the accounts are cleaned out, and if you're smart, you'll save yourself the embarrassment of fighting a losing battle. It's over." Click. The line went dead. He hung up on his postpartum wife and his newborn baby. Standing there on that freezing front porch, shivering in the biting Illinois wind while my fresh surgical stitches burned, a terrifying realization washed over me. I opened our joint banking app with trembling fingers. Access denied. Password changed. I tried our shared credit card at a nearby gas station a minute later, declined. I pulled up the account where Julian and I had spent 10 agonizing years penny pinching, saving every single dime for our retirement and our future. $0.00. Completely, utterly empty. At the time, I still wanted to believe there had to be some insane explanation. Months later, after everything came out in court, I would eventually learn that none of this had happened while I was recovering in the hospital. The hospital stay was just the final, convenient execution window. The planning, the plotting, At the time, I had no idea it had started 11 months prior, deep beneath the surface of a marriage I thought was built on bedrock. Looking back now, that is the part that still makes my chest cave in. During my entire pregnancy, Julian had played the role of the ultimate flawless husband. When morning sickness kept me bedridden for weeks, he brought me ginger tea and crackers without a single sigh of frustration. When my ankles swelled up to twice their size during the third trimester, he would kneel on the hardwood floor every single night, gently massaging lavender lotion into my aching feet while we watched reruns on television. When I couldn't decide between a soft sage green or a pale yellow for the nursery, he painted it himself over a single weekend, whistling happily. At the time, I believed he was just a loving husband. I didn't know yet that he was a cold, methodical predator who had weaponized my love and trust against me. The new homeowners, sensing the absolute wreckage of my life, retreated into the house for a moment and came back out carrying my old canvas diaper bag. "We found this pushed into the corner of the garage," the woman said, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Inside were a few spare diapers, a pack of wipes, 2 baby bottles, and a tiny stuffed bunny. That was it. Everything else I had ever owned in this world, my childhood photo albums, my mother's hand-sewn heirloom quilt, my wedding album, and the wooden rocking chair my late father had built with his own hands before he passed away, was completely gone, swallowed up by a ghost life that no longer belonged to me. I forced myself to mutter a weak, "Thank you," because I didn't have the breath to scream. I strapped Maya safely into her car seat in the back of my friend's freezing car, curled into the passenger seat, and sobbed so violently that my C-section scar felt like it was tearing open all over again. My mother, Martha, a fierce, resilient woman who had spent 35 years teaching high school literature before retiring to a quiet, modest wooden house in the sleepy suburb of Rockford, Illinois, answered my call on the second ring. "Elena." The second she heard the jagged, broken hitch in my breathing, she didn't need details. A mother's radar cuts through miles of silence. "Mom," I choked out, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. I don't have a house anymore. Julian. He took everything." There was a heavy, suffocating silence on the other end of the line. No dramatic gasps. Just the quiet, immovable steadiness that only mothers possess when the world is burning down around their children. "Come home, Elena." "Mom, I don't even have enough money for gas to make it to Rockford. I'm stranded." "We'll figure it out, sweetheart. Just come home." I hung up. I looked down at my phone, then down at my sleeping baby. I couldn't drive an hour and a half to Rockford. My body was physically incapable of it, and my gas tank was scraping dangerously close to empty. I needed cash, and I needed it immediately. With shaking hands, I directed my friend to drive us straight into downtown Evanston, stopping in front of a small jewelry store. The owner was an elderly gentleman who looked at my tear-streaked face with quiet understanding. He silently took the antique diamond ring off my finger, an heirloom passed down from my maternal grandmother, and evaluated it under his lens. "I can offer you $1,850, he said quietly. "If I think about it," I whispered, tears spilling over my lashes. "I won't have the courage to do it." He understood. He carefully counted out crisp bills, placing them into a small white envelope. Before I turned to leave, he slid a small, soft, polishing cloth across the glass counter toward me. "No charge for that," he said softly, offering a sad, compassionate smile. It was such a microscopic act of human kindness that it almost broke me all over again. I paid my friend for her gas and time, settled the immediate medical follow-up expenses, bought a bulk pack of diapers and formula at a nearby pharmacy, and crammed everything into my diaper bag. When I finally stood inside the bustling, fluorescent-lit Greyhound bus terminal in downtown Chicago, clutching my sleeping baby tightly to my chest, I checked my wallet with a sinking heart. Out of the $1,850 for my grandmother's ring, after paying for emergency supplies, temporary transit, and basic survival necessities. Exactly $35 remained. $35 to my name. A newborn baby in my arms. A fresh, bleeding surgical scar across my stomach. And 1,000 miles of emotional wreckage stretching out before me as I waited in the freezing terminal for the bus that would take me back to my mother's door. I didn't know yet that losing my home was only the very beginning. The bus ride from Chicago to Rockford felt like it lasted a lifetime. Every time the heavy engine rumbled or the tires hit a pothole on the interstate, the vibration shot straight up my spine, making my healing C-section incision burn like fire. I kept my newborn daughter, Maya, bundled tightly against my chest, her tiny, rhythmic breathing the only thing keeping me anchored to reality. By the time the Greyhound bus finally wheezed to a halt and deposited us at the Rockford station, the afternoon had bled into a dark, freezing evening. The station waiting room was cramped, stale, and smelled faintly of cheap coffee and damp wool. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh, sickly glow over a handful of weary travelers. That was when I saw him. Standing near the ticket counter was an elderly man. Let's call him Arthur. Arthur was in his late 60s, wearing a faded, frayed canvas jacket and carrying a worn leather travel bag that looked as tired as he felt. He was frantically patting down his pockets, searching for something he had clearly lost. I watched as he leaned toward the ticket clerk with a quiet, unmistakable note of defeat. "I must have dropped my wallet," Arthur murmured, looking exhausted and genuinely embarrassed as people stared. "Without that wallet, I don't have enough cash for a ticket home." The ticket clerk, hardened by a long shift, didn't even look up from her computer screen. Her voice was flat and devoid of warmth. "I'm sorry, sir. Company policy. No payment, no ticket. The next bus isn't until tomorrow morning." Arthur swallowed hard, his shoulders slumping under the weight of his jacket. He didn't argue or throw a fit. He just stepped aside to let impatient travelers push past. Someone muttered a harsh complaint under their breath. Arthur looked away, his cheeks flushing with a deep, pained sense of humiliation, staring down at the scuffed linoleum floor. I stood there, in the middle of the waiting room, holding Maya in one arm and my heavy diaper bag in the other. My heart gave a heavy, conflicted thud. I slowly unzipped my coat and reached deep into my pocket, feeling around for the white envelope containing the remaining cash from my grandmother's ring. $35. That was my entire net worth. $35 to buy formula, diapers, and whatever emergency groceries my mother and I would need over the next few weeks until I could figure out how to survive. A voice inside my head, sharp, panicked, and entirely rational, screamed at me. "Are you insane, Elena? You have a newborn baby. Your husband threw you into the street. You cannot afford to give away a single cent." I looked down at Maya. I looked at the white envelope in my hand. I kept hearing my late father's voice echo in my memory from the winter of my 10th birthday, when our car broke down on a freezing highway in rural Illinois, and a complete stranger pulled over to spend an hour helping us change a flat tire in the freezing sleet, refusing to take a single dollar for his trouble. My father had looked at me and said, "Elena, always remember, when you see someone drowning, you don't check to see if they can pay you back before you throw them a life ring. You just throw it." What if that were my father standing there stranded? What if he were the one being turned away? I didn't let myself think twice. If I thought about it, fear would paralyze me. I shifted Maya carefully, walked straight past the impatient crowd, and stepped up to the ticket counter. "I'll pay for his ticket," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the hum of the room. The ticket clerk looked up, surprised, while Arthur turned sharply toward me, looking instantly flustered and uncomfortable. "No, young lady," Arthur said quickly, his pride showing. "You have a baby in your arms. I can't take your money. That's entirely too kind." "I know what I'm doing," I replied, offering him a small, tired smile. "You didn't ask me to, but I'm choosing to." While the clerk printed out the paper ticket, Arthur looked down into my canvas diaper bag where Maya was peeking out from her pink blanket. A soft, gentle smile broke across his face, softening the deep lines carved around his mouth. "She is beautiful," he whispered. "Thank you. What is her name?" "Maya," I said. "And yours?" "Arthur," he replied, giving my hand a solid, comforting grip. "I won't forget this kindness, Elena. I truly won't." I nodded politely. The boarding call for his bus echoed through the terminal. Arthur gave me one last grateful nod, picked up his worn leather bag, and walked through the sliding glass doors into the night. I watched him go, completely unaware of who he really was or how our paths would cross again. 10 minutes later, I walked out into the cold parking lot where my mother was waiting. My mother, Martha, a fierce, resilient woman who had spent 35 years teaching high school literature before retiring to a quiet, modest wooden house in the sleepy suburb of Rockford, had spotted me before I even reached her car door. The moment she saw the bulky diaper bag and my exhausted posture, she threw her car door open and hurried across the pavement. She didn't ask a single question. She didn't demand an explanation right there in the freezing wind. She simply wrapped her arms around me as carefully as she possibly could, avoiding my fresh surgical stitches, pulling me tight against her chest. "Oh, my sweet girl," she whispered, her voice cracking slightly. That was all. No lectures, no angry rants about the man who had destroyed my life. Just two simple, unconditional words that let me know I was no longer alone in the dark. We drove the short distance to my mother's modest home, a cozy, aging wooden house that hadn't changed much since my childhood. The same faded blue recliner sat by the living room window where my father used to read. Only now, the back of the chair was draped with clean, folded baby blankets. My mother had spent weeks knitting in anticipation of what was supposed to be a joyous holiday visit. That first week melted into a blur of raw survival. Feed Maya, change a diaper, swallow another dose of prescribed pain medication, and try desperately not to cry where my mother could see me. Then, roughly 4 days after I arrived, the quiet reality of our situation caught up with us. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Maya had finally drifted off to sleep in her portable bassinet, and I walked out into the small, warm kitchen to grab a glass of water. My mother was sitting alone at the oak kitchen table. Spread out before her was a yellow legal pad covered in neat, precise columns of numbers, alongside an old calculator. She was tapping away at the plastic buttons, her brow furrowed in deep concentration. The moment she heard my footsteps on the linoleum, she hastily grabbed a magazine and flipped the legal pad face down, offering me a weak, unconvincing smile. "What are you doing, Mom?" I asked gently, leaning against the counter. "Oh, nothing, sweetheart, just looking over some household expenses," she replied, her eyes avoiding mine. I walked over and gently pulled the magazine away. "Mom, you've never been good at hiding things from me. What is this?" She let out a long, shuddering sigh, her shoulders dropping. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a helpless, protective sorrow. I was calculating how long my monthly Social Security check can cover groceries, utilities, and formula for the three of us. Those numbers on that yellow legal pad shattered me far more than standing outside my sold house in Evanston had. My mother had worked 35 years as an educator, earning a modest retirement. She deserved to spend her golden years reading books by the window, tending to her garden. Instead, at 68 years old, she was sitting at her kitchen table worrying about how to stretch store-brand formula because her daughter had nowhere else to go. "I'll go back to work," I said instantly, the panic rising in my chest. "I can find something remote or—" "Elena, look at you," my mother interrupted softly, cutting across my words. "You had major abdominal surgery less than 2 weeks ago. You have a newborn baby who feeds every 2 hours. I know, but I can't let you. She reached across the table, taking my trembling, cold hand in her warm, steady palms and squeezing it tightly. For once in your life, Elena, stop trying to carry the weight of the entire world on your own shoulders. Let someone else carry you for a little while, and that is what mothers are for. I wanted to believe her, but looking at the yellow legal pad, a heavy, suffocating weight settled over my chest. I knew that resting wasn't an option for long. That night, as the rain drummed a steady rhythm against the kitchen window and Maya slept softly in the next room, I sat in the dark living room staring out into the backyard. The wind chimes my father had hung years ago swayed gently in the breeze. At the time, I still didn't know the full extent of what Julian had done. I had no idea that months later, during the federal investigation, I would find out he had been planning my financial execution for nearly a year. But sitting there in the quiet dark, listening to the soft breathing of my baby girl, a cold, hard spark of resolve ignited deep inside my bones. I couldn't change what Julian had done, but I was not going to let him win, and I was not going to let my mother sacrifice her retirement to clean up his mess. That night, I pulled a blank notebook from my bag. I wrote down every date I could remember, every bank transfer, every document Julian had asked me to sign during my pregnancy. At the time, I had no idea that notebook would become the backbone of the case that eventually brought him down. The grief was still there, heavy and suffocating, but beneath it grew something far stronger. I was a mother now, and a mother who has nothing left to lose is the most dangerous force on God's green earth. Roughly a week after Arthur Pendleton had boarded that bus out of Rockford, the quiet routine of our household was interrupted by an unexpected arrival. My mother and I had spent the previous days meticulously cataloging every piece of correspondence Julian had ever handed me. My mother believed that waiting had never solved a single problem. Through a trusted friend from her local church community who navigated Chicago's professional circles, a door had finally opened. That was how I found myself sitting in an understated, sunlit law office, staring across a polished mahogany desk at Susan Keller. Susan Keller had spent 4 decades prosecuting financial fraud. Her eyes, sharp, observant, and entirely devoid of false pity, missed nothing as she listened to my story from start to finish, her pen scratching rhythmically against a yellow legal pad. When I finally finished detailing how I had come home from the hospital to find strangers moving into my house, Susan laid her pen down. "I have some good news and some very sobering news, Elena," Susan said. "I don't suppose the good news comes first?" I let out a dry laugh. "It does," Susan replied. "The good news is that your husband, Julian, has committed multiple felonies. What he did crosses from a messy divorce into outright criminal fraud and identity theft." Her expression darkened. "The sobering news is that proving it in court won't be fast or easy. Whoever handled the closing on your house relied on a document carrying your authorization." Susan slid a single sheet of paper across the table. "Do you recognize this?" My breath caught. It was a formal power of attorney document granting Julian full legal authority for real estate and financial decisions. Right at the bottom was my signature. "I never signed this," I whispered, the blood draining from my face. "I was in the hospital recovering from an emergency C-section." "I know you didn't," Susan said grimly. "Julian used a notorious mobile notary service to push this through while you were incapacitated under heavy medication. He legally weaponized your hospital bed to strip you of your home. Undoing the sale is going to be an uphill legal battle because of how cleanly he executed the paper trail." My hands curled into tight fists. "So, Julian just gets away with it?" "No," Susan leaned forward. "We don't let him get away with anything. But to stop him, we have to prove intent, systematic fraud, and exactly where every single dollar went." During your pregnancy, did Julian ever ask you to sign stacks of routine paperwork? I closed my eyes, running backward through the months of my pregnancy. Insurance forms, pre-admission packets, HR documents, mortgage updates. Dozens of them. Whenever Julian handed me a clipboard pointing to a yellow tab, I signed it without reading. He was my husband. I trusted him. Dozens, I murmured. I signed whatever he put in front of me. Susan nodded slowly. That is how long cons work, Elena. They build a fortress of false trust so that when the trap springs, you lock the door yourself from the inside. We spend days going through every financial document: tax returns, retirement statements, old mortgage notes, bank statements, emails, and credit card histories. My mother and I combed through every single line item under the dim light of the kitchen lamp. The deeper we dug, the more monstrous Julian's master plan appeared. The money had not vanished overnight. It had been systematically drained over 11 months, starting 3 days after our pregnancy announcement. 5,000 here, 8,000 there. Every outgoing transfer had been masked by Julian as market adjustments or temporary liquidity shifts, explained away with a warm smile and a kiss on my forehead while telling me stress was dangerous for the baby. One rainy Thursday afternoon, my cell phone rang. It was Susan Keller, her voice holding an edge of breathless urgency. Elena, I found something incredible. According to digital metadata our investigator recovered, the house wasn't just listed after you went into labor, it was secretly listed nearly 3 months earlier. I stopped breathing. That was precisely when Julian insisted I stop checking our banking apps because financial anxiety was bad for the baby. At the time, I had no idea what he was doing. But months later, as Richard Ames would later confirm during our deep analysis of Julian's phone logs and bank transfers, Julian had planned every agonizing detail of my destruction while telling me he loved me. 2 days after that phone call, while the autumn rain lashed against the windows, a familiar beat-up pickup truck pulled slowly into our gravel driveway. My mother peered through the floral curtain. Elena, there's an older gentleman walking up the front steps. He's asking for you. I pulled the front door open. Standing there in the same faded canvas jacket and worn leather travel bag was Arthur Pendleton. Arthur? I breathed in surprise. Did you miss your bus? He chuckled softly. No, Elena, I made it home fine weeks ago. But my late wife would have given me an absolute earful if I didn't return to properly settle a debt of honor. He pulled out a sealed white envelope. I came to repay the $35. I laughed softly. You drove all the way out here just to hand me $35. I came because human decency is a rare currency. Arthur smiled gently. When someone hands you a lifeline when you're drowning, you don't just forget. Come inside out of the rain. My mother just brewed coffee. Within minutes, we were seated around the kitchen table talking about ordinary things. The Chicago Cubs, the Illinois winters. Arthur never mentioned money, and neither did I. And then headlights suddenly swept across the kitchen window. The sleek, midnight black Lincoln Navigator pulled smoothly into our driveway, followed by a second luxury sedan. Arthur quietly set his coffee cup down, a mild resignation crossing his face. I suppose they finally tracked me down. Before I could ask, heavy footsteps echoed on the porch. The front door swung open, and 2 professionals in sharp business suits stepped into the hallway. The younger man spotted Arthur and gasped in relief. There you are, Mr. Pendleton. We've been tearing half of northern Illinois apart, trying to locate you for 3 days. Your security detail has been beside themselves, and the executive board has been sweating bullets. The kitchen fell utterly silent. My mother stared in sheer astonishment. Arthur gave an apologetic smile. I simply wanted a little peace and quiet for a change, David. The executive blinked in sudden recognition of me, then looked back at Arthur. Sir, the emergency board meeting regarding the acquisition contracts has already been postponed twice. Board meeting? I interrupted, my voice trembling. Wait, what board meeting? Arthur stood up slowly and turned toward me. I'm afraid, Elena, that I haven't been entirely honest with you back at that bus station. You said you lost your wallet. I did. That part was true. He smiled gently. And you assumed I was just a stranded, ordinary old man. Weren't you? I was traveling alone. Arthur nodded. I simply forgot to mention that my family built and currently owns Pendleton Industrial. The room seemed to spin. Pendleton Industrial, the manufacturing and engineering titan behind thousands of regional jobs and household names across Illinois. The quiet old man in my kitchen was one of the most powerful industrial magnates in the state. Arthur looked at me with deep respect. When you paid for my ticket with your last remaining dollars, Elena, you didn't know who I was. You helped me because your heart wouldn't let you walk away from someone in pain. He paused, resting his hand gently on the table. I didn't come here to throw money at your problems like a fairy tale benefactor. I know someone who specializes in recovering hidden assets. Richard Ames. When I first mentioned your case to him, he told me flat out, Arthur, I don't take cases like this anymore. The paper trail is too messy. But I convinced him to look at your files. Arthur reached into his briefcase and slid a pristine business card across the table. Richard Ames, senior forensic financial consultant and asset recovery specialist. Meet with Richard, Arthur said softly, turning toward the door where his team waited. He is the best forensic accountant in the country. Let him look at the wreckage your husband left behind. You decide what happens after that. As Arthur walked out into the cool evening and climbed into the waiting navigator, I looked down at the business card. The next day, sitting across a sleek glass table in Chicago, Richard Ames looked up from the thick stack of files I brought him. He adjusted his glasses, his eyes piercing and analytical. Listen to me very carefully, Elena, Richard said, his voice cutting through the quiet office with absolute authority. You don't win cases like this with money. You win them with documents. Every lie leaves a paper trail. Every paper trail leaves evidence. The evidence is already there. My job is simply to find it. The map of my pain was vast, but for the first time since I stood outside my sold home in Evanston, I wasn't fighting in the dark anymore. I finally had a direction. 2 days after Arthur introduced me to Richard, the first major crack appeared in Julian's carefully constructed world. It all began on a crisp Tuesday morning in downtown Chicago. I was sitting inside Susan Keller's law office, going over bank routing numbers with Richard, when the front door chime rang. Susan's legal assistant hurried into the conference room looking wide-eyed and deeply unsettled. Susan, the assistant said, breathless, there's a woman here to see you. She says it's an emergency. Her name is Clara Sterling. I froze. The name hit me like a physical blow. Clara Sterling. The violin prodigy whose glossy social media posts and late-night phone calls had quietly poisoned the final months of my marriage. The woman Julian had chosen over his pregnant wife, convincing me she was just a colleague. Susan exchanged a swift glance with Richard, then nodded. Send her in. The heavy oak door swung open and Clara walked in. At the time, I expected her to walk in with an air of triumphant arrogance. Instead, Clara arrived looking utterly exhausted and hollowed out. Julian had lied to her, too. She stopped dead when she saw me sitting at the conference table. A flash of pure defensive panic crossed her face. Elena, Clara whispered, her voice cracking. Toya siya ginaim lang. Nung kibiet anam talambe voy mot ongoy. Funu wa sinkun to kong ongunoy. I didn't yell. I didn't lunge across the table. I just looked at her. This woman who had knowingly played a part in tearing my family apart, and felt an unexpected wave of heavy pity. Sit down, Clara, I said quietly. You're safe here. It took Clara several minutes to gather her breath before she could finally speak. her words tumbling out in a broken, frantic rush. "I thought I was special," Clara choked out, wiping her eyes. "Julian told me that you and he were separated, living under the same roof for convenience. He convinced me to invest my life savings, $550,000, into an exclusive commercial real estate development fund." She reached into her handbag and slammed a small black external hard drive onto the polished mahogany table as if it burned her fingers. "Last week, I tried to pull out $50,000 for European tour," Clara continued. "His phone was turned off. His office told me he was on an extended leave. The bank told me the investment account didn't exist. It was a shell corporation. He took everything I had. Elena, every single penny I earned from years of touring. He never loved me. I was just another mark." Susan Keller picked up the hard drive, turning it over in her hands. "What is on this drive, Clara?" "Copies of emails," Clara whispered. "Financial spreadsheets, audio recordings, and backup exports from Julian's office computer. Recorded phone calls where he laughed about how easy it was to fool his pregnant wife. Emails where he plotted the exact timeline to liquidate your joint assets while you were in the hospital." Richard Ames leaned forward, examining the device closely. "If these files are authentic, they could change everything." Clara nodded frantically. "I didn't alter a single file. I want him to pay for what he did to both of us." For the next 24 hours, Richard worked tirelessly. At the time, I held my breath, terrified that this might be another cruel trap. But the following afternoon, Richard called us back into the office with a definitive verdict. "The metadata matches Julian's digital footprint precisely," Richard confirmed, his eyes gleaming. "The bank routing numbers, and the timestamps, the audio files, they are 100% authentic. This isn't just a civil dispute anymore. This is a federal RICO case waiting to happen." Armed with Richard's forensic accounting charts and Clara's digital archive, Susan Keller filed an emergency motion for a federal injunction and asset freeze. The day of the hearing at the Cook County Courthouse in downtown Chicago was cold, gray, and bitterly windy. The courtroom was packed. Julian walked through the double doors wearing a custom-tailored charcoal Armani suit, his hair neatly slicked back, carrying an aura of supreme, unshakable arrogance. He spotted my mother and me sitting quietly in the back row and offered a cold, dismissive smirk, entirely convinced that his web of fake paperwork was bulletproof. When the presiding judge called the court to order, Susan Keller stepped up to the podium. "Your Honor," Susan began, her voice echoing clearly. "The defense will attempt to frame this as a routine marital dissolution. We are here to prove it is a systematic, premeditated criminal enterprise." Richard Ames took the stand first. With absolute precision, Richard showed the court how Julian had quietly moved more than $1.8 million through forged documents and hidden accounts over 11 months. Julian's arrogant smirk instantly vanished. His face drained of color as he leaned over to whisper frantically to his defense attorney. Then, Susan Keller dropped the final blow. "Your Honor, the prosecution requests permission to play Exhibit 47B into the courtroom record." Susan pressed a button on her tablet. The courtroom speakers crackled slightly, and Julian's unmistakable voice filled the room, crystal clear. "Relax, Clara. The paperwork is completely airtight." The closing went through while she was doped up on painkillers in the maternity ward. "By the time she realizes her bank accounts are empty and her house belongs to someone else, I'll be long gone with the cash. She's too exhausted and naive to ever figure it out." A collective gasp rippled through the packed courtroom. Julian's defense attorney immediately sprang to his feet, launching into a furious counteroffensive. He argued that the audio was artificially manipulated, accused Clara Sterling of fabricating the hard drive out of a bitter, scorned revenge plot, and formally motioned the court to dismiss all charges as a coordinated smear campaign. Furthermore, the defense insinuated that our legal team, backed by undisclosed elite billionaires, had improperly influenced the proceedings. For a terrifying 10 minutes, The courtroom erupted into fierce legal arguments. Julian sat back down, his composure partially recovered, offering a cold glare across the room. Susan Keller didn't panic. With decades of federal trial experience behind her, she stepped forward with absolute poise. "Your Honor," Susan said smoothly, holding up the forensic certification report, "the defense claims tampering. However, every single digital file on this drive has been cryptographically verified through third-party server logs, matching Julian Vance's personal IP address, encrypted office signature, and bank authorizations. There's no fabrication here, only accountability." The judge stared hard at Julian's legal team and then ordered a recess to review the technical verification reports. As the judge stepped back into his chambers, the courtroom plunged into a heavy, suffocating silence. My mother squeezed my hand tightly under the table. My heart pounded against my ribs. I didn't know yet how the judge would rule on the defense's motion to suppress the evidence. Every second felt like an eternity. 20 agonizing minutes later, the bailiff's voice boomed. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Harrison." The judge walked back in, his expression solemn, carrying a thick folder of documents. He sat down, adjusted his glasses, and looked directly down at Julian's defense counsel. "The court has reviewed the cryptographic metadata and forensic validation reports," Judge Harrison announced, his voice echoing across the silent room. "The defense's motion to dismiss and suppress evidence is summarily denied." Julian slumped heavily back into his chair, the last vestige of color draining entirely from his face. When the prosecution officially rested, the judge looked down from the bench and asked if I, as the primary plaintiff, wished to make a victim impact statement before sentencing. I gently handed sleeping Maya to my mother, stood up, and walked slowly to the podium. My legs were steady. My breathing was calm. I looked across the aisle at Julian. He looked smaller now, sweating, shrunken inside his expensive suit. "Your Honor," I began, my voice clear and unwavering. "When I first discovered what my husband had done, I felt like the ground had vanished beneath my feet. I thought I had lost everything. My home, my savings, my security, and the life I spent a decade building." I paused, glancing down briefly at my daughter resting safely in my mother's arms, before looking straight back into Julian's terrified eyes. "Sitting here today, I realize how wrong I was," I continued. "Julian spent months plotting to destroy my life because he believes that human beings are just commodities. But he didn't destroy me. The things I lost were only ever material things that can always be rebuilt. The person who truly lost everything today is the man sitting across from me. Because while I walked away with my dignity, my integrity, and my newborn daughter, Julian has lost his humanity, his honor, and his freedom. I don't want his stolen money back. I want justice." The courtroom fell into a profound, breathless silence. The verdict came quickly. Guilty on every count of grand larceny, identity theft, and corporate fraud. His assets were permanently frozen, his financial licenses revoked, and federal prosecutors took over the criminal case, forwarding the complete investigative file directly to the United States Federal Prosecutor's Office for immediate criminal indictment. A pair of uniformed bailiffs stepped forward. Heavy silver handcuffs clicked sharply onto Julian's wrists. As he was hauled out of the courtroom in absolute disgrace, his expensive suit dragging slightly, he didn't dare look back at anyone. As Julian disappeared through the courthouse doors in handcuffs, I thought the hardest part was over. Months later, I would eventually learn that rebuilding a shattered life takes far more than a single courtroom victory. But standing there in the hallway with my mother and my baby girl looking out at the bright Chicago skyline through the glass windows, I finally took my first real breath of air. The transition from surviving a storm to finally living under a clear sky doesn't happen overnight. And I learned very quickly that true healing is not a straight line. Months later, even after the court cases were closed and the restitution funds were secured under Susan Keller's guidance, the invisible scars remained. At the time, I didn't know it yet, But financial abuse leaves a unique, lingering trauma that physical safety alone cannot instantly cure. For the first year in our new apartment, sleep was a luxury I rarely experienced. Every time the wind rattled the window panes at night, I would jolt awake, my heart racing, convinced that the locks had been changed and strangers were moving my things. Worse still was the simple act of signing my own name. More than once, when I stood at the post office or the bank holding a standard delivery slip, my hand would freeze mid-air, the pen trembling violently between my fingers as cold sweat broke out across my back. The deep-seated terror of inadvertently signing away my life all over again took years of conscious, agonizing effort to unlearn. I didn't rush out to buy back a sprawling luxury estate or chase after superficial symbols of status. Instead, I chose absolute simplicity. I found a bright, airy loft apartment located right in Evanston, just a few blocks away from the cozy ceramic studio where I used to spend my afternoons working with clay. The apartment was modest compared to the Victorian house Julian had sold out from under me, but it possessed something money could never buy: a genuine soul. It had tall windows flooding every corner with afternoon light, a sturdy crib for Maya, and a spacious work table for my pottery wheel. There were no hidden traps here, no secret bank accounts, and no lies whispered in the dark. It was just a safe sanctuary to begin again. Life slowly settled into a gentle, restorative rhythm. Morning started with baby Maya, waking up in her crib, stretching her tiny arms toward the sunlight. I would brew herbal tea, strap Maya securely into a carrier against my chest, and walk down to the ceramic studio. Working with clay taught me a profound lesson about survival. In traditional Japanese philosophy, pottery fractures aren't hidden. They are mended with gold, turning the broken pieces into something far stronger and more beautiful than before. Every pot I shaped felt like a quiet meditation on my own recovery. More importantly, every piece had a tangible value. 3 months after opening the loft, I received my first major corporate commission from a local boutique gallery, a custom set of 20 glazed tea bowls. Working late into the night while Maya slept peacefully, I fired, glazed, and polished every single piece with my own hands. When the gallery owner handed me the final payment check, and I walked down to the leasing office to hand over the money for my first completely self-funded month of rent, a powerful wave of validation washed over me. I wasn't surviving on settlements or charity. I was standing entirely on my own 2 feet. We weren't alone in this new chapter, either. Arthur Pendleton, the industrial magnate I had met at the Rockford bus station, remained a respectful, distant presence in our lives. Arthur didn't hover or play the savior. He understood boundaries. Once every few months, he would send a handwritten note or drop by briefly on a Sunday afternoon just to share a cup of coffee with my mother, Martha, discussing classic literature while taking Maya for a short stroll around the courtyard, before quietly taking his leave. My mother found a renewed sense of quiet companionship in his steady friendship. Even Clara Sterling took a very long time to find her footing. 2 full years after the trial, an envelope arrived in my studio mailbox with a handwritten return address from out of state. Inside was a sincere, deeply remorseful letter from Clara, detailing how she had picked up the pieces of her career, warning others about financial fraud through public speaking engagements, and enclosing a modest check to be donated anonymously to the local women's shelter where I volunteered. I mailed her a simple postcard wishing her peace. I had eventually learned that you cannot move forward into a clean future while carrying yesterday's resentment. Looking back across the vast expanse of what I had lost and what I had fought to reclaim, my perspective on life changed entirely. For a long time, I believed that a home was defined by mortgage deeds and upscale zip codes. But sitting on the balcony of our loft, one late autumn afternoon, watching the golden leaves drift softly down onto the Evanston pavement, while Maya, now a curious toddler, laughed softly beside me, I finally understood the truth. A house is just bricks, mortar, and drywall. It can be bought, sold, or stolen by a thief in a tailored suit. But a true home is built from something indestructible. It is constructed from unwavering courage, radical honesty, quiet resilience, and the steadfast presence of the people who refuse to abandon you when the storm sweeps through. True healing is never about pretending the pain never happened. It is about learning how to stand taller, love deeper, and breathe easier because you survived the fire. The wind chimes outside our balcony caught a sudden gust of crisp autumn breeze, filling the air with a clear, melodic ring. I tightened my arms around my daughter, pressed a soft kiss to her forehead, and smiled as I looked toward the horizon. The past was behind us, the storm had cleared, and our real life was finally beautifully underway.